Oh, Vietnam. If you're American, French, or Chinese, you might know it as the place your grandpa fought in and lost. It's one of the few nations on Earth that still claims to be communist while having one of the fastest growing economies on Earth. The Vietnamese have been a regional power for centuries because of their unique location. They have never been able to project this power outwards, but with a huge population, growing economy, and increasing industry in Vietnam, many people are seeing it as the power of the future. So will Vietnam be a great power? If not the regional power, what is Vietnam's future? The first thing to talk about is what I always talk about, Vietnam's geographical situation. The first thing that anyone notices when they see Vietnam is how long it is. It is quite a thin country straddling the coast of the South China Sea. This made Vietnam a very naval country, and the ocean is something the people and economy depends on. But that's not the only water the country has. If you zoom in on the north and the south, you'll see two important deltas, the north for the Red River and the south for the Mekong. The Red River is not too large, only stretching up into China, but the delta on the base is where Vietnam has functioned for centuries. It is home to Hanoi, the capital, as well as around 75% of agriculture and industry of northern Vietnam. And when the Vietnamese first coalesced as a people group, it was in this northern delta where they built their kingdoms. The southern delta is surprisingly even more powerful. It makes up almost the whole tip of southern Vietnam, housing its most populous city, Ho Chi Minh City. And even though the Mekong isn't really in Vietnam, it still goes through plenty of other countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and up into China, stretching to Tibet. The Mekong River Basin covers around half of the Indochina region, which gives Vietnam a huge amount of control over the region's trade. And Vietnam doesn't depend on these rivers like some other countries do, because Vietnam is already a wet country. Vietnam is quite tropical, especially in the south, with huge rainforests. The north is a little more temperate, but still very tropical compared to other temperate areas like Europe. Frankly, tropical areas are hard to live in, which is why the north of Vietnam was the center of the country for most of its history, and what makes this area even harder to live in are the mountains. Just look at this, a mountainous jungle valley. The mountains are mostly in central Vietnam as well as its western and northern borders. Most people avoid this problem by physically avoiding it. The Vietnamese population is crowded onto the coast as well as the two deltas, but it comes with a major upside. Vietnam is practically impossible to conquer, just ask the Chinese, the Mongols, or Americans, three major world powers who fail in the Vietnamese jungle mountains. And if you do end up conquering it like the French or Han Chinese, the Vietnamese people will not let you replace them, even living under Chinese rule for 1,000 years. Through its mountains, jungles, length, and rivers, it's just one of the hardest places on Earth to take over. Fast forward to today, and Vietnam under the Socialist Republic of Vietnam is fast growing. The country was split in half after the French left the occupation of Indochina. Of course, the two sides went to war. The Communist North was aided by China and the USSR, and the capitalist South was aided by the USA and some regional allies. The war was gruesome and ended in the North winning and the communist takeover of Vietnam, merging in 1976. But in 1986, after economic stagnation, the country implemented what is known as Doi Moi. It opened up Vietnamese markets, encouraging private ownership of farms and industry and foreign investment. And ever since Doi Moi in the 2000s, Vietnam's economy has boomed, increasing GDP per capita by around 10 times. And nowadays, the GDP growth rate is around 7% annually, which is very, very high. The GDP is already around 354 billion US dollars, 40th largest on Earth. But due to that high growth rate, it's expected that in 2050, Vietnam will be around the 20th largest economy on Earth. It is potentially the fastest growing economy out of any nation. But how is their economy divided? In terms of agriculture, Vietnam is a beast. The tropical climate means plants can thrive there. It is a major exporter of rice, sugarcane, cassava, cashews, maize, bananas, and coffee. It exports millions of tons of each. In relation to agriculture, Vietnam's fishing industry plays a key role in its system. Because of all the rivers, lakes, and huge coastline, Vietnam has been a seafood powerhouse for its whole history. Millions of tons of shrimp and catfish are caught and exported. Another huge industry is mining, and specifically petroleum extraction, although that's not to say mining minerals like antimony, bauxite, gold, ruby, and iron isn't a big thing in the Vietnamese mountains. Vietnam has some offshore oil reserves which are currently capable of bringing in over 400,000 barrels a day. Renewable energy just is not on the menu in Vietnam. And probably the biggest industry in Vietnam nowadays is manufacturing. Contributing to over 40% of the GDP, it's becoming more and more common every year to find products wherever you might live that say, made in Vietnam. Check your shirt right now. I'm sure a large chunk of you have this phrase on it. Its proximity to China, aka the factory of the world, means it can take a significant number of jobs from China or be given to them. Electronics companies are moving from South Korea to Vietnam as well. 40% of Samsung phones are made in the country, and other manufacturing industries include automobiles, textiles, food processing, chemicals, and footwear. If anything is pulling Vietnam out of poverty, it is the manufacturing industry. And lastly, there is the service industry. Yeah, there's banking and finance, but the main service is tourism. In 2019, Vietnam welcomed 18 million tourists to their country, the most in its history. They come for the mega cities of Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh, or the plethora of jungle-filled mountains and bays. Just look at this. No wonder the tourism industry is blowing up. It's no surprise that whenever Vietnam opened to the world's economy through doi moi or foreign investment, they prospered. Manufacturing, tourism, and the Vietnamese's pockets blew up when Vietnam gave the world an access to their huge population. But just what will that population look like in the future? Right now the population is around 96 million people. It will peak in around 2050 with 109 million and slowly decrease after, stabilizing at basically what it is today by 2100. This means that even though the population will grow, it will not be too much of a burden on the country's food, water, and housing supplies. However, not all these people are the same. Vietnam is split into multiple ethno-linguistic groups. The one in charge is the Kin, constituting around 85% of the population, but especially in the highlands, other groups dominate, such as the Hmong, Dao, Tay, and Muong people, with about 50 others. The people of Vietnam do not really live in cities though, with an urbanization rate of around 34%. The two largest cities make up around half that rate, and as Vietnam transitions to a more middle-power developed nation, more people will live in the cities around the country, which will grow the manufacturing industry even faster, causing even more prosperity. The growing but stable population is amazing for any country going into the future. Okay, so Vietnam has a great economy and demographics. Surely there has to be some major issue, and there is. Look right above Vietnam, it's China, but wait. These are both communist in name countries in the same region who both opened up to the world at the same time. Just look at their flags. They should be best friends. That's not the case though. Vietnam is anything but a Chinese ally. A, thousands of years of attempted and successful conquest in Vietnam isn't gonna go well with the people there. B, the whole Vietnam War aid thing was less as allies and more against the Americans. After the war, Vietnam set up a new Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, which China hated. Vietnam and China had a short 3-week war in 1979 after that, so all ties were ruined shortly again after the Vietnam War. And C, the sea. Specifically, this sea, the South China Sea. Vietnam claims this region as their economic exclusive zone, a zone where only they are exclusively allowed to operate economically. The problem is their claim overlaps with Malaysia's, Brunei's, the Philippines', Taiwan's, and most importantly, China's. China basically claims the whole sea. They honestly need it if they want a chance to challenge the US navally. And you see these islands in the middle, they're key to owning the sea. Vietnam used to own all of the Paracel and Spratly Islands, but after the Vietnam War, China took all of the Paracels. To this day, they still own them, but Vietnam still has 29 islands in the Spratlys. Instead of taking them by force, China has decided to just build new islands and reefs to increase their chance of owning the region. Tensions are high in the South China Sea, even hosting a clash between Chinese and Vietnam's ships over a Chinese oil rig in Vietnam's EEZ. This whole situation has essentially made Vietnam an American ally, because face it, if China and Vietnam ever got into a naval war, Vietnam isn't going to win. Ever since 1995, relations between Vietnam and the US have been warming up, as well as with other Western nations, and nowadays both agree on keeping China in their zone, which has made them friends despite their past together. Vietnam has a good future ahead of it. Its economy is one of the fastest growing in the entire world. Its stable yet growing population ensures that once more people urbanize, an even faster economic growth will occur, especially in manufacturing fields. Its geography both gives it one of the best defenses on Earth and control over all trade in the Mekong River, but that same geography places it next to increasingly aggressive China, forcing Vietnam to open up to Western nations economically and militarily for aid against a potential Chinese attack. So to answer the question in the title of this video, Vietnam is absolutely an economic power of the future, or Vietnam will be an economic power of the future if China doesn't take it over. But don't worry, the Vietnamese people are used to Chinese attacks. I'm sure it'll be fine. If you enjoyed this video, please give the thumbs up and subscribe buttons an economic boom. Thank you so much for watching this whole video.